This is The Change Physician, episode 171. Welcome back to The Change Physician. I am Melissa Cady, the Challenge Doctor, with my co-host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro, on this lovely day to talk about why small things are important, or perhaps why small things matter in relationships or life. I mean, I think we can apply it to just about anything. But I think that there's a few things that we should touch on, because there's a previous episode, and I think all this came about because we really like what the Gottman Institute puts out. I think there's some really good conversations we've had in the past. If you haven't checked out, you can be part of the newsletter. We're not part of their institute, but I think that there's some really good things to consider when you're trying to enhance your relationship, whether it's personal, possibly even professionally. I think all these things apply in life in general. But we did have an episode on the 4 horsemen of relationships, and I know that I didn't know about it until Kevin brought it up. So I might let him do a quick recap on that as to why maybe we should be aware of these 4 horsemen in order to pursue a healthy relationship with whoever it is in our life. Go ahead, Kevin, take it away.
Take it away. Yeah. So the Gottman Institute, that's Gottman, GOTTMAN.com. And John, and I think his wife's name is Julie Gottman. So they've done a lot of research on it, which is why we've done previous episodes, because it's research backed, not just like spout off the hip and say, oh, I saw a bunch of people and this is what I think. Right. And one of the big takeaways that I got out of their material is this 4 horsemen. And these were things that when they were videotaping relationships, like people who were married, they could look for subtle behaviors that then were predictive of divorce. And that's like John Gottman's call to fame, is that being able to do these little interviews and saying without about 95% certainty, which is sort of absurd, whether or not a couple would get divorced. And the 4 kind of behaviors that they identified were criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. And we did a whole episode on the 4 horsemen in the past. Criticism is pretty self-explanatory. So when you're critical of the person you're in a relationship with, and not like constructive, we're talking like destructive. Mm-hmm. Contempt is probably the worst of the behaviors, is when you start not seeing them as someone you respect anymore. So you're treating them and their behaviors as sort of identified of a flawed person, and you're responding in such a way as, well, you're always like that, or you just aren't that good, right? So you're very contemptuous of the person. That's like the big red flag. Defensiveness is when you're in the relationship and someone says something that may or may not even be criticism, and yet you respond very strongly to it. And then there's stonewalling, is when you just sort of shut down and don't even, you don't even respond because you don't believe that a response is going to be useful. Like you're not going anywhere with it. The things are unsolved, or not unsolved, unsolvable. So right. You instead of actually trying to engage, you actually shut down, in which case now there is actually no chance for things to improve. So the importance of anything, like knowing about the 4 horsemen when it comes to relationships, and you made a great point on this, is the fact that we may be talking specifically about maybe romantic relationships or with your spouse or other loved one, but these are relationship. There's a core of this is relationship work is good for relationships. So I think in general, this may be specific to kind of those romantic relationships, just understanding if you're just talking to anybody, maybe a business partner or, somebody else at the hospital, this stuff can come up, and be a little bit more aware of, well, am I contemptuous of this person? Why? Am I stonewalling? Why? Because that awareness then, and this is a running theme with the change physician, when you have an awareness of a behavior, now you then can be active in choice to either be intentional about change or not, right? You may not decide to do a corrective action, but if without that awareness, you can't really then be active, right? It's all passive behavior after that. So super, super important then, if you're aware that you're excessively criticizing, if you're aware that you're excessively defensive in your feedback or in your discussions when somebody perhaps comes to you with something that needs corrective action, if you're stonewalling, meaning you just completely ignore it, or worse, if you're actually responding to people with contempt, that's a big warning sign for you. Yeah. And when it comes to your personal relationship, then being aware of those then can do or initiate major action. So that's a little recap of the 4 horsemen and the importance of awareness and intention when it comes to doing behavior change if you actually want to improve the relationship.
Right. And even, you hear all the time, this is my work wife, this is my work husband. Like, you might actually spend more time with the people you work with than the actual romantic partner at home. So, obviously that duration of time spent with them, certain behaviors can affect each other in certain ways. And you have to be aware of whether it's at work or at home. And obviously there's different levels of intimacy based on what's going on. I won't go into that. Sometimes things get confused for people that spend too much time with other people, which might get you in trouble and pull you away from the people you should be putting quality time into. So that was a very vague statement, obviously.
But it was really interesting to me. And this is one of the things, sometimes I think we just should record, like not even try to like have a title on this stuff, because you brought up a really interesting point. And when you're working in a highly intense field, and you're spending long periods of time from someone else, you're going to be in those scenarios where you have the work wife or work husband. And so I'm like sitting here going, okay, well, depending on your personality, then how does that impact your actual relationship with your spouse?
No, that's true. Yeah.
Because so, I mean, there's so much loaded.
Well, it can get confusing, right? Because people might feel closer, and then they might create a romantic relationship out of something that shouldn't be.
Well, there's the risk of that, right? There's the risk of straying, or I would actually perceiving a complex work relationship as potentially romantic, which is rife with problems to begin with. Inappropriately assigning a relationship, like if you're, whatever your sex is and whatever your gender preferences are, there's some degree that sometimes, well, is this because we're good friends, or is this because we're romantically interested in each other? There's the jealousy that's inherent with that. When you now have a shared connection with somebody else, if your relationship at home is not stable, or they don't understand your environment that you're in,
right,
there's a whole host of concerns that come up. And so if you then are have a work wife or work husband, and then you're coming home to a spouse that perhaps your relationship is on unfirm bedrock, it becomes even more important to see this stuff, because then those things that you may be perceiving as criticism, it may actually, and you're maybe acting defensive to it, taking a step back, actually taking a moment in time, well, what do they understand about my relationship? How aware are they of this environment that I'm in? A highly charged, often very stress-inducing environment like the hospital or health system may be, and then taking a moment to sit in their shoes to really kind of analyze that, I think it becomes super, super important. And I hadn't thought about that when we started this episode until you said it. That's a big deal. Yeah.
Well, it also makes me think of the sense, and we talk about stress, anxiety, a sense of threat as a human being, and the power struggles of maybe, and we're going to assume a monogamous relationship, whether it's heterosexual, homosexual, but let's say, for example, that there's a wife that's at home, has 2 or 3 children, and she's not in the medical field. And then you have the husband working with another woman who's a physician. And how is that person perceiving that situation? Do they feel less than? They're not a physician. They're not spending as much time with you. They feel like they're taking the biggest load with the children because they're driving them crazy. Like there's such a different environment that I think that plays into later what we'll talk about, like the little things you do to help bridge and communicate and help understand each other, so that you can bridge that gap more than that feeling of separation and distance, which can very easily continue to drift you apart. So yeah, I think there's a lot that goes on in that.
Well, and
that's just one example.
Well, and that I'd be kind of interested in this, because so we are a good example of 2 different relationships here, right? So my spouse is medical. She is a physician. We met through medical school. So we have all these shared experiences, and we have 2 different specialties that we pursued.
Yes.
And now thinking back on that, like, I honestly can't imagine being married to a non-medical person, because of the fact that I don't have to explain everything. Like now our lives are super different now. Like the way that our lives are structured and what we do is very different. But in the first, like literally 10 years of our marriage, I didn't have to come home and explain why I was coming home if I was late, or if I had to do this, or if I was getting a text from somebody. We didn't have any of those potential
senses of threat.
Yeah. Now, which is different because your spouse is non-medical.
Oh yes.
So I'm kind of curious, like, how has that played out? Because did you meet after training? I can't remember.
I met him in my last my pain fellowship, right in the midst of it. So I think he's never dated anyone that was a physician. We got like totally opposite of you. So we're in a non-traditional relationship. Are you going to say something?
Well, I was going to say non-traditional.
In the sense that I'm a female physician.
Oh, okay.
And he's non-medical.
Mm-hmm.
He's dabbled in some various things, really not focused on any particular career, had at some point thought about sports and broadcasting. And then he just basically, you work to, just live, nothing targeted to any particular career directive. But now he's doing podcasting. But that initial phase, which I found when I first started working after my training, of course, I ended up writing a book too. That was like, I almost had an affair with writing a book. It was like, it's like there was so much time away from him too with that. That's another conversation later, just writing a book. But I felt like my life was not crazy at all, and that the hours were so much better than residency, even though I was on call. And I'd have to tell him, oh, this case went longer. I had a surgical complication with somebody. I got to stick around, and explaining that, and him not knowing if I'm going to be coming home at 5 o'clock. And this was really kind of a low level of intensity for call. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, part of me was thinking, there's no way he could have handled, our relationship probably couldn't have thrived if I met him during internship. Just no way. Because the quality time together was like, I work 120 hours a week. How is that when you're trying to create a relationship? It's not like you've already established it and maintaining it, mm-hmm. or trying to just survive. You meet someone new. I mean, that's a real dilemma as a physician. If you're constantly on call, it's just almost impossible to really, unless that person understands and wants to wait it out. So I think it was good that I met him when I did, because it was a mild level of variance from a traditional kind of job. Anyway, I don't know if that's what you're asking.
No, it is. And so I'm kind of curious though, is then you're still, so you may not necessarily be in training, and it's still it's still intense as an attending. Sometimes it can be more intense or not. But then how did you address those issues with who ultimately, Corey, who ultimately became your spouse? Is like, how did you recognize that they felt threatened by these weird hours? And then like, basically, how did you bridge that gap? Because I think there's a lot of physician couples, obviously, but there's a lot of physicians that aren't married to other physicians.
Yeah.
And so that's totally outside of my wheelbox. So I'm like really curious is like, how then did you surmount those barriers?
Well, let me just say that I think by the nature of it, I kind of wanted to always pursue someone outside of medicine. I can't really explain why, but I always felt like I've always looked for something different, something unique. And so I knew the world of medicine. So I kind of wanted someone that wasn't in it, because they could bring something different. So that was my mindset, not thinking, oh, they need to understand what I'm going through.
Well, but you still need to, when you are in a relationship and there's conflict, you still need to navigate that conflict.
Sure.
So if there was conflict, then you had to overcome it.
So something people might not think of is that he'd never dated. I mean, I'm a female physician. I just think of me as me. I'm a physician, but sometimes I realize people put me on a little podium in some way, like as if, oh, she's so successful and all this like external stuff. And I'm like always feeling like I'm still striving, so it's different. But I think this is my view, is that I think he was quite proud and quite, just he had a great respect for the fact that I was a female physician. And so initially, I think you're willing to like tolerate and deal with this like different, like he's kind of getting the feel for like what my lifestyle's like. And I don't think it really creates a problem initially, especially because I said it was mild compared to my initial hardcore training beforehand. So I think it was just palatable enough where he respected what I did. He wanted to be understanding, and he adores me and he loves me, and so he wants to try to understand. So I think that's a key component. It's not just me, but I think we're good at communicating, and I would let him know, hey, this is, it looks like this case is going to go longer, or, or express a little bit of dissatisfaction. I won't be able to see him sooner. And I think they're just the little things that trying to communicate, because you're kind of helping him understand your day, and how things are not predictable all the time in medicine. And I'm sure he probably talked to other people to maybe understand that too. But I think it was just our communication initially, and also the buffer of the initial part of the relationship that had such a newness that he wanted to try to be accommodating.
The newness factor. Yeah. The honeymoon phase, basically.
Yeah.
Is what you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's my first take and impression. But
Well, it makes me think, man, we need to get we need a physician with a non-physician who's outside of the honeymoon phase. So actually, I'll just make an announcement here. If you're listening to this and you are a physician and a non-physician couple, and you perhaps have had some difficulty communicating with your spouse around these issues, please contact us. I would love to hear you, and I would love to actually have a discussion with you, because I think it's rocky. I mean, I can see how it would be very, very difficult. Because the other thing I was thinking about specifically is, you were outside of training, and so you had a very early focus on lifestyle early on. You weren't doing this thing where you were trying to maintain, again, 80 plus to 100 hours as an attending either. And that can be a little bit different. And then I'm just like, some of these people who are in these really, really intense specialties and haven't backed off, I'm like fascinated. How in the world, like, how do you initiate a relationship in that kind of environment? And then how do you sustain it? Because that's super, 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 super hard.
I think an important point to make is I was very intentional about not working full time.
Yeah.
So that was around the time when I met him in January. I finished my training in August. We were off cycle. And literally I was working 3 days a week after. So I created more opportunity for me to spend time with my new boyfriend. So that was, I think I wanted it for myself more than anything, but I think looking back on it, it probably was helpful for me to nurture the relationship I just found. And then the next year I was like, quit your job. I want to go for 5 weeks to Australia, New Zealand. I've always wanted, to go, and start off on our adventures with, doing some of the things we love to do, which is traveling together. So, so I think it started off that way. Things got a little bit more busy with work after that, when I tried to establish 4 days a week and on an employee type status. So that had its own little misery at times, just because I think I like the freedom to kind of create my own days as I see fit.
So did you ever then see later on, like after you passed through that honeymoon phase, did you then start noticing these type of behaviors that we talked about, the 4 horsemen type of behaviors, like the contempt or the stonewalling, defensiveness, criticism? Have you ever had any experience with those then with your relationship?
So I consider, I consider my husband really enjoys quality time with me. I've recognized that he's been a mirror for me to realize that I've been, I don't want to say running away from relationships, but I've kept myself so busy. And it's a very complex phenomenon where you're used to being busy and filling your time and not depending on anybody. But you do it in a way sometimes where you start sacrificing the quality time that your other person needs. And so you end up diving yourself into project after project after project. And then you want to do it so well that you're so consumed by that I get focused on things and projects versus focused on the relationship that matters the most to me. And so I think that I recognized in myself that I would get a little bit of resentment towards my own husband who wants to spend quality time with me because he's wanting to spend, I'm feeling pulled away from the very projects that I want to get done, which are not serving me in the way that, it's not actually benefiting the relationship. I've made my own, I guess, goals and things to be the priority. So I have to say a lot of it revolves around that. And, there's always that roommate thing when you move in and there's different ways that you live, and that's another topic. But for the most part, I would say that the hardest thing is recognize how different we are. Like after the honeymoon phase, the very things that I was attracted to are the things that might drive me mad, that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think there was episodes of any of those things. But I think, thank God, we were always able to talk about them.
So criticism was the one that I'm assuming then criticism and defensiveness would probably be the two that.
I'm probably the worst with him.
Yeah.
I'm probably, it feels a little bit, I don't know if I want to call it shameful. But I think this is an important point. We talk about self-compassion all the time, and we say be kind to others. It's easier to be kind to strangers. There's less invested emotionally, but I think we need to have companion compassion. I need to see if there's something out there about that. They talk about it in relationships all the time, but it just sounds good. But sometimes it's when they really hit a nerve in you, which is super true about you. It's easy to lash out and to be defensive. So I'm definitely guilty of that.
So then becoming more aware of, say, this critical or criticism and or defensiveness when your interactions with your spouse.
Yeah.
Then what were the small things that you did to change, or how did that change your behavior? How did you intentionally change your behavior? Or did you try to intentionally change your behavior?
Well, I have to say, I think there's a little bit of luck involved here, because I think my husband's a really good role model on how to bring up conversations with he won't just spout it out. Like he'll think about it overnight, through the week, or whatever he needs to do. And he'll bring up the issue without an emotional charge to it, in a way that I can't help but see the truth. And it's kind of painful at times.
Well, so where did he learn that? Because that is like a super crucial relationship strategy, is never pull up baggage in a highly emotionally charged moment, right? Because then you're fighting his mother. Okay. Because that's like super huge relationship, like guru-ness, awesomeness. Yeah. Because most of us want to lash out, right?
Yeah.
And then being able to take it and remove it and put it. So the issue is the issue, and not us getting wrapped into the issue becomes the issue. Yeah.
He's able to distill it into the very core, almost the stuff I didn't really see. He knows me better than I know myself. Let's just put it that way. He's put in the time to understand me. But his mother, who died at a young age of 46, was the closest thing to him. And she knew him so well. I mean, he's very unique, just like myself. And she knew what made him tick. And she knew how to, get him to do things that he didn't want to do. I mean, she didn't do it as a, badger kind of person. It was just kind of all right, this is the way it is, and this is going to be the consequence. And he knew she meant business, but she was very extraordinarily loving, and did all the little things that some things we're probably going to bring up. But you asked me what are the small things that I did in order to, is that what you were asking me?
Well, if you're noticing that you are being more critical and or more defensive when it comes to
Uh-huh.
interactions with your spouse, like, so again, awareness, now you're aware of the action.
Mm-hmm.
What were the things that you intentionally did to change that? So, Corey did one thing because he was aware of it and he said, oh, I have these stuff. And then he stepped back and he processed it and then codified it and put it in a place where it was not emotionally charged. But what did you do? What were the small things that mattered?
Yeah, so sometimes there are certain things that I still struggle with. But as he says, it's not what you're saying. It's saying, I'm sorry, or I'll do that, or whatever. It's all in the action. So he's very much paying attention to the action, not the words. But the things that I do is I actually, in my mind, create a pause to like just sit down or look at him when I'm talking about, or make an intention to have a conversation about things concerned about, and recognize that I appreciate really the amount of love that he has for me to sit down and talk about these things, like to acknowledge him with what he's saying, instead of, this is my first reactions, I just want to spout out and like defend myself. And so I'm always struggling with that.
So the specific episodes then that you're kind of talking about now are when he presents what could potentially be perceived as a harsh criticism of you, criticism, the rough thing about criticism is it is at its core, it can be constructive. There's destructive and constructive criticism. And so you're saying is when she brings something up that may be critical, your awareness of the reaction that you tend to default to has allowed you to intentionally change by creating things like pause or a moment to compose rather than that reactive sort of snap back.
Well, if it's really actually kind of a gift to myself, because I realize I don't get as wound up inside feeling that need to defend myself. Like it actually, I don't know how to describe it, but it's just like taking a deep breath and just letting things like simmer on the inside. It's not like I get mad. It's a natural inclination. It's almost like a reflex for me to just give a reason or an excuse or whatever the thing is. I mean, my perceived reality as to why I did this or didn't do that or whatever it was. But I'm also a very loving person to him, in the sense that, from hugs or being silly, the stuff that most people on the outside don't see. There's that little silliness you might have together, the kisses, the hugs, talking about early on. I mean, I think there's just a lot of display of love and a commitment. Like it's always been very clear that both of us are all in. And I think that's an important part, like 100%, like nothing ultimatum, nothing ever like that. Like it's a genuine, like we want each other in each other's lives, and we make it very clear that we're willing to work on it no matter what, even if we have the same conversation 30 times and nothing's changed. Like there's certain things that are like, I don't want to say problems, but they're usually our own inherent character flaws that are hard to extricate out of ourselves, and they impact the relationship. So I think you're always constantly honing those behavior patterns based on your inherent flaws. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, you brought up some of the things that you do, mm-hmm. and whether they were you were aware initially or not, but the small acts of loving kindness was right. One thing, in addition to when you're feeling potentially defensive, creating a pause that allows you to kind of almost emotionally reset before responding.
Yeah.